The rust was a living thing. It crawled over the bones of the old Ford tractor, bled down the corrugated tin of the barn roof, and stained the padlock on the front gate a deep angry orange. John Callahan, who the world had once called Cal, saw it as a kindred spirit. He felt the same slow, inexorable decay in his own bones, a corrosion of the soul that had begun in the dust and fire of a land 10,000 miles away. His farm, or what was left of it, was a graveyard of failures. Fences sagged like tired old men. Fields lay fallow, choked with thistle and Johnson grass. The farmhouse itself, a two-story skeleton of peeling paint and boarded windows, seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the final exhale that would bring it crumbling to the earth. It was his inheritance, the last remnant of a life he no longer recognized as his own. He was a ghost haunting the tomb of his own family. The November wind was a bitter, biting thing, a physical presence that clawed at his worn jacket and found the hairline cracks in his composure. It sounded like the whine of incoming rounds, a high, thin shriek that always made the metal in his leg ache with a phantom cold. He stood on the porch, a mug of black coffee growing cold in his hand, and stared at nothing. His eyes, once sharp enough to spot a target at 1,000 yards, were now flat and empty, reflecting the gunmetal gray of the sky. Inside him, the ghosts were always stirring. They were louder in the quiet hours just before dawn. Faces slick with sweat and grime. The easy grins of young men who believed they were immortal. Laughter inside the belly of a C-130. The smell of diesel, chewing tobacco, and fear. And always, always, the face of Dave Shepard, Shep. His brother in all but blood. The dog handler. The one with the steady hands and the quiet smile, who could calm a jittery private or a four-legged predator with the same low murmur. The memory hit him then, unbidden and brutal, as it always did. A flashbang in his skull. The sun was a merciless hammer in the Afghan sky. The air tasted of baked earth and something metallic. Shep was ahead of him, his German shepherd, Aries, scouting point. The dog was a marvel, a sable-furred shadow that moved with liquid grace, his focus absolute. They were clearing a village, a cluster of mud brick compounds that had been quiet for too long. The silence was the problem. Silence was never empty. It was full of things you couldn't see. Got a scent, Cal? Shep's voice had crackled over the comms, calm as ever. Aries is keyed on that doorway, the green one. Cal had raised a hand, halting the team. He'd scanned the rooftops, the shadowed alleys. Nothing. A child's toy, a small wooden horse, lay on its side in the dust. That was the detail that always came back to him. The little horse. He'd given the signal to advance. Shep and Aries moved as one, a seamless unit of man and animal. They were 10 feet from the green door when the world tore itself apart. It wasn't a bang. It was a physical concussion that ripped the air from his lungs and threw him backward like a rag doll. A wave of heat and pressure and noise that was so absolute it became its own form of silence. When he came to, the world was red. Red dust, red sky, and the red ruin of what had been his team, his friends, his brothers. He remembered crawling, dragging his shattered leg, screaming Shep's name into the ringing void. He found what was left. There was no green door. There was no Shep. And of Aries, the magnificent warrior dog, there was nothing but a single, blood-soaked leather lead lying in the crater, Kea. All of them, except him. The universe, in its infinite cruelty, had left him behind to remember. He blinked, the Afghan sun replaced by the bleak Maryland sky. The coffee in his mug had a skin on it. He hadn't moved, he didn't know for how long. The ghosts receded, leaving behind their usual residue of cold sweat and a hollow ache in his chest. This was his life now, a long, slow circle around a hole that could never be filled. He finished the cold coffee in one gulp, the bitterness of familiar punishment. It was time for his patrol, a habit ingrained so deep it was muscle memory. He walked the perimeter of his property every day, a soldier without a war, guarding a territory of ghosts and rust. He checked the fences, the tree line, the locks on the outbuildings that held nothing but dust and rat droppings. It was pointless, but it was a ritual. It was structure. It was all he had left. He moved with a slight limp, the only visible sign of the blast that had ended his career as a Navy SEAL. The scars on his soul were the ones that crippled him. He walked the western fence line, where his land bordered the slovenly, junk-strewn property of a man named Jedediah Klein. Klein was a mean, lazy drunk who let his hounds run wild and treated his land like a landfill. That's when he heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was too sharp, too full of pain. A high, desperate whimper, cut short. Cal stopped. His head tilted, every sense suddenly on high alert. The numbness receded, replaced by the cold, clear focus of the operator. He scanned the tangle of briars and fallen trees that marked Klein's property line. The sound had come from over there, from the direction of an old, collapsed tobacco barn that sat rotting just inside Klein's fence. He heard it again, a low, guttural growl this time, followed by another pained yelp. It was the sound of an animal in deep distress. Something in him, a piece of his old self, he thought long dead and buried, clicked into place. He moved toward the fence, ignoring the rust and the barbs, and slipped through a gap with a fluid motion that belied his limp. He was no longer a ghost, he was a hunter. The smell hit him first. A thick, cloying stench of feces, damp earth, and misery. The barn was a collapsed ruin, its roof a jagged maw open to the gray sky. He moved silently, his boots making no sound on the damp leaves. He peered around a stack of rotting timbers, and he saw him. Chained to a steel post driven into the ground was a German shepherd, but to call him that was an insult to the breed. He was a skeleton draped in mud-caked fur. His ribs were a washboard, his hips sharp, jutting points. One of his ears was torn, and a fresh, oozing gash ran along his flank. A heavy logging chain, thick with rust, was cinched tight around his neck, rubbing the skin raw. But it was his eyes that stopped Cal cold. They were deep, intelligent eyes, full of a pain so profound it was almost human. But beneath the pain, there was something else, a fire, a defiant, unbroken spirit that refused to be extinguished. In those eyes, Cal saw the same desolation, the same trapped fury, the same haunted loneliness that stared back at him from his own mirror every morning. He saw a fellow soldier, left behind on a forgotten battlefield. The dog let out a low growl, a rumble that started deep in his chest. He tried to stand, to put himself between Cal and something behind him, but his back legs trembled and gave way. He sank back to the mud, his head still high, his gaze unwavering. Cal saw then what he was protecting. Tucked into a hollow beneath a piece of fallen roof was a single shivering puppy, no more than a few weeks old. A wave of cold, clean rage washed through Cal. It was an emotion so pure and so powerful it felt like coming up for air after a lifetime underwater. This was not the chaotic, senseless violence of war. This was simple, deliberate cruelty, and it was a line. "Easy boy," Cal said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur he hadn't used in years. The voice he used for spooked horses and new recruits. "I'm not gonna hurt you." He took a slow step forward. The dog's growl intensified, but it was a warning, not a threat. There was discipline in it. He was assessing, not reacting. "What in the hell do you think you're doing on my property?" The voice was slurred and belligerent. Cal didn't turn. He knew who it was. Jed Klein emerged from behind the barn, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in one hand. He was a big, slovenly man with a mean little glint in his piggy eyes. "This dog's in bad shape, Klein," Cal said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He's my dog. I'll do with him what I please," Klein sneered, taking a swig from the bottle. He kicked at the dog, a lazy, brutal motion. The boot connected with the animal's ribs. The dog let out a sharp cry of pain but didn't cower. Instead, he lunged, hitting the end of the chain with a force that should have been impossible for an animal in his condition. The chain snapped taut, jerking him back with a sickening choke. That was it. The line had been crossed. Cal turned to face Klein. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't square his shoulders or ball his fists. He simply looked at him. The emptiness in his eyes was gone, replaced by something ancient and lethal. It was the look of a predator who has just chosen his prey. "You're not going to touch him again," Cal said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. Klein, fueled by whiskey and ignorance, took a step forward. "Or what? You gonna cry on me, pretty boy soldier?" Cal didn't move a muscle. He just let the silence stretch. He let Klein see the abyss that had opened up behind his eyes. He let him feel the sudden drop in temperature. Klein's drunken bravado began to falter. He was looking at a man who had walked through hell and brought a piece of it back with him. He saw a man with nothing left to lose and no fear of consequences. "This dog," Cal said, his voice a low whisper that cut through the wind, "is now on my side of the fence, which means you are trespassing. Get off my land now." He took one deliberate step toward Klein. It was all it took. The bully's facade crumbled into dust. Klein's eyes widened. He took a stumbling step back, then another. He muttered something under his breath, a pathetic attempt to save face, then turned and shambled away, disappearing into the woods. The silence that returned was different. It was charged, heavy. Cal turned back to the dog. The animal had watched the entire exchange, his head cocked, his intelligent eyes missing nothing. The growling had stopped. Cal knelt in the mud, wincing as his bad leg protested. He kept his movements slow, deliberate. He held out his hand, palm up. "It's all right, soldier. The battle's over." The dog watched him, his breathing shallow. He sniffed the air, then took a hesitant step forward, the chain rattling. He lowered his head and nudged Cal's hand with his cold, wet nose. It was a gesture of surrender, of trust, a fragile truce. Cal spent the next hour in the cold and the mud patiently working. He went back to his house and returned with a bowl of fresh water, a can of wet food, and a set of bolt cutters. The dog drank thirstily, his whole body shuddering. He ignored the food at first, keeping his eyes on the puppy. Cal understood. He pushed the bowl closer to the small den. The father ate only after he saw his pup begin to lick at the gravy. Loyalty, even in this state, beaten and starved, his primary concern was his child. Finally, Cal brought the bolt cutters to the chain. The dog flinched at the metallic snap but didn't pull away. The heavy links fell into the mud. The dog was free. He stood, shaky but dignified, and looked at Cal. There was a question in his eyes. "Come on," Cal said softly. "Let's get you home." He carefully scooped up the tiny shivering puppy, tucking it inside his jacket. The big dog watched, then, with a trust that was both heartbreaking and profound, he limped after Cal, following him through the gap in the fence. away from the ruin of the barn and toward the uncertain sanctuary of the derelict farmhouse. Two broken soldiers, heading for a new firebase. Back in the relative warmth of his Spartan kitchen, Cal set to work. He laid out old army blankets by the wood stove and gently placed the puppy on them. The little thing immediately curled into a tight ball and fell asleep. The father stood guard over it, a silent, unmoving sentinel. "All right, let's get a look at you," Cal murmured. He filled a bucket with warm water and found a soft rag. The dog watched him, wary but not aggressive. Cal started with the gash on his flank, cleaning away the mud and dried blood with a practiced gentleness. The dog trembled but stood his ground. He was a warrior, accustomed to pain. As Cal worked, he talked, his voice a low, steady rumble. He talked about the weather, about the rust on the tractor, about anything and nothing. It was the tone that mattered, the calm cadence that said you are safe here. As he cleaned the filth from the dog's neck, where the chain had rubbed it raw, his fingers brushed against something under the ear. He pushed the matted fur aside. His blood ran cold. There, faded but unmistakable, was a tattoo, a series of numbers and letters. He knew the format instantly. It was a military service number, a registry for a military working dog. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. This was no ordinary stray. This was a veteran. A dog tag, a cheap aluminum disc, was still attached to the makeshift rope collar beneath the chain's path of destruction. He carefully worked it free. One word was crudely stamped into it, Kaiser. It meant nothing to him. But the tattoo meant everything. He dried the dog as best he could, his mind racing. He noticed something else. The dog's posture, the way he held his head, the way his eyes tracked Cal's every move. It was all familiar. He raised his left hand, fingers together, and made a short, sharp downward motion. The military signal for sit or down. Instantly, the dog lowered himself to the floor, his haunches settling with perfect, drilled precision. He didn't break eye contact. Cal felt a knot of ice form in his stomach. He tried another, a subtle two-fingered gesture to his own eyes, then pointing to the door. Watch that entrance. The dog's head swiveled, his gaze fixing on the kitchen door, his body tense and alert. These weren't just standard commands. They were the modified signals his unit had used, the ones he and Shep had refined in the field. "No way," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "It can't be." He stumbled back, his leg giving a sharp throb. He leaned against the counter, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The ghosts were back, not as memories, but as screaming, present-tense certainties. He stared at the dog, at the noble shape of his head, the sable coloring hidden beneath the grime, the intelligent, knowing eyes. He knew those eyes. He had seen them across dusty tarmacs and in the bellies of helicopters. He had seen them lock onto a target, filled with lethal focus. He had seen them look at Shep with a love so pure it was tangible. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling so badly he could barely dial. There was only one person he could call, a man who had moved from the field to a desk at Langley, but who still owed him a favor. A big one. "Miller?" a gruff voice answered. "It's Cal," he said, his own voice sounding distant and strange. There was a pause. "Callahan? Jesus, it's been years. You okay? I need you to run a number for me, Mike. An MWD registry. It's off the books. Need you to dig deep." "Cal, I'm not really in that world anymore. Mike, please." The desperation in his own voice shocked him. "It's important," Miller sighed. He knew the tone. He'd heard it before from men who were seeing things they shouldn't be seeing. "All right, give it to me." Cal read the numbers from the tattoo, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. He could hear Miller typing on a keyboard. The silence stretched on, filled only by the crackle of the wood stove and the frantic beating of his own heart. "Okay, got a hit," Miller said finally. "But this is weird, Cal. The file is heavily encrypted, redacted at the highest level. DOD, DARPA, this is way above my pay grade, but I got the basics. MWD, German Shepherd, male. Assigned to?" Miller went quiet. "Assigned to who, Mike?" Cal demanded, his knuckles white where he gripped the phone. "SEAL Team 3. Handler, Petty Officer David Shepard." Miller's voice was soft now. "Calzine, Ares. Cal, the file says he was killed in action. Same day as Shep and the rest of your team. This can't be right." The phone slipped from Cal's fingers and clattered to the floor. The room tilted. The air grew thin. He looked at the dog, who was still watching him with that same steady, patient gaze. Ares. He wasn't dead. He was here. Battered, starved, and broken, but alive. The official report was a lie. Someone had faked his death. Someone had stolen a U.S. military asset, a hero from the battlefield, smuggled him halfway across the world, and left him to rot at the end of a chain in Jed Klein's backyard. The cold rage from the barn returned, but now it was a white-hot furnace. This wasn't just about animal cruelty anymore. This was a desecration, a violation of a sacred trust. They hadn't just stolen a dog. They had stolen a warrior. They had stolen the last living piece of his team. "Ares," Cal whispered, the name feeling foreign and holy on his tongue. The dog's ears twitched, his head tilted. A low, soft whine escaped his throat, a sound of recognition, of memory. He pushed himself to his feet, took a hesitant step, and then another, and laid his head on Cal's knee. Cal sank to the floor, his legs no longer able to support him, and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck. He buried his face in the coarse, dirty fur, and for the first time in 5 years he felt something other than the gnawing emptiness. He felt a purpose, a mission. He would find the men who did this, and he would introduce them to the ghosts they had helped create. The first 24 hours were a blur of quiet care. Cal cleaned Aries' wounds with antiseptic, his hands steady. He fed him small, protein-rich meals every few hours, slowly rebuilding the dog's strength. The puppy, which Cal had started calling Shep, thrived under the warmth of the stove and the constant, gentle presence of his father. A fragile peace settled over the broken-down farmhouse. A temporary ceasefire in a war Cal was just beginning to understand. His call to Miller had set gears in motion that he couldn't control. He knew that. By flagging Aries' service number, he had lit a beacon. The people who had stolen a multi-million-dollar piece of DARPA technology would know someone was looking. They would come. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. He spent the day preparing. He wasn't the man he used to be, but the instincts were still there, buried under layers of grief and rust. He was a SEAL. His home was his firebase. He walked the property again, but this time with new eyes. He saw fields of fire, choke points, avenues of approach and retreat. He noted the deadfall tree that would provide cover, the collapsed stone wall that could serve as a fighting position. Inside, he checked his weapons. A service pistol he was legally allowed to own, a hunting rifle, limited ammunition, not enough, he improvised. He filled glass bottles with gasoline and stuffed rags in the necks. He set up tripwires using fishing line and tin cans in the woods surrounding the house, simple low-tech alarms. He barricaded the downstairs windows, leaving only small firing ports. He turned his tomb into a fortress. Aries watched him the entire time. The dog's strength was returning with astonishing speed, the advanced genetics Thompson had mentioned. He moved with a new confidence, the limp already less pronounced. He followed Cal from room to room, a silent shadow, his eyes alert. He was back on duty. He knew a storm was coming. It broke just after dusk. The sky had bled from gray to a deep, starless black. The wind howled, rattling the window frames. The first alarm went off, a clatter of cans from the eastern tree line. Cal was already moving. Aries, watch our six, he commanded in a low voice. He grabbed the rifle and moved to the front window. Aries didn't need to be told twice. He positioned himself at the back door, low to the ground, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Cal peered through his firing port. 2 figures, moving with professional silence, detached themselves from the shadows. They were dressed in black, carrying suppressed weapons. Not junkies or local thugs. These were professionals, mercenaries. They moved in a practiced leapfrog pattern, covering each other as they advanced on the house. Cal's heart was a cold, steady drum in his chest. The fear was there, a familiar coiling in his gut, but the training was stronger. He let them get closer. He needed to make the first shot count. One of them paused by the old well, using it for cover as he scanned the house. A mistake. Cal centered the crosshairs on the man's chest. He controlled his breathing. Inhale, exhale, squeeze. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The sound was deafening in the quiet house. Through the scope, he saw the man jerk backward and fall, a dark shape against the dying grass. Contact front. The second man reacted instantly, dropping to a knee and returning fire. A spray of bullets stitched across the front of the house, splintering wood, punching through the thin walls. The sound of suppressed rounds was a vicious thump, 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 like a giant angry hornet. Cal was already moving, low crawling away from the window. Never fire from the same position twice. He heard a vehicle, a heavy truck, roaring up his long driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. They were trying to flank him, to pin him down. A third man smashed through a side window, rolling into the living room. He was fast. He brought his weapon up. He wasn't fast enough. From the shadows near the back door, a black and tan missile launched itself across the room. Aries hit the man in the chest with the force of a battering ram, all teeth and fury. The man screamed, a high, strangled sound, as 60 pounds of trained muscle and righteous anger slammed him to the floor. The rifle clattered away. Aries' jaws locked onto the man's arm, shaking his head with savage force. The sound of snapping bone was sickeningly loud. Cal was on his feet, pistol in hand. He put 2 rounds into the man's chest without hesitation. Neutralized. Good boy, Aries, to me. The dog released his hold and was instantly back at Cal's side, blood on his muzzle, his eyes blazing. Outside, the truck screeched to a halt. Doors slammed. More men, at least 2. They were using the vehicle for cover, laying down a heavy base of fire. Cal was trapped, outmanned and outgunned. He grabbed one of the gasoline-filled bottles. He lit the rag with a lighter, the flame flickering in the darkness. He scrambled to the other side of the room, to a window that faced the truck. He waited for a lull in the shooting. It came. He smashed the window pane with the rifle butt, leaned out and threw the bottle in a high arc. It landed on the hood of the truck, shattering. A ball of orange flame erupted in the night, engulfing the front of the vehicle. Shouts of panic and anger. The covering fire stopped. He had bought himself a few seconds. He had to end this now. He moved to the back of the house, Aries padding silently behind him. He kicked open the kitchen door and plunged into the darkness of his own backyard. The cold air was a shock. The smell of gasoline and cordite filled his nostrils. He circled around, using the dilapidated barn as cover. He could see them now. Two more figures, momentarily blinded by the fire, their attention focused on the front of the house. He was behind them. The hunter had become the hunted. He raised his rifle. He was calm. The world had narrowed to this single violent moment. There were no ghosts. There was no past. There was only the mission, protect his fire team of two. Before he could take the shot, a new sound cut through the chaos. The unmistakable whump 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 of helicopter blades, coming in fast and low. A searchlight stabbed down from the heavens, painting the entire scene in brilliant white light. "This is federal law enforcement. Drop your weapons. Hands in the air," a voice boomed from a loudspeaker. The two remaining mercenaries were caught, frozen like deer in the headlights. For a split second, they hesitated. Then one of them made a choice. He spun, raising his rifle toward the farmhouse. A single, unsuppressed rifle shot cracked from the darkness near the helicopter's landing zone. It sounded like a clap of thunder. The mercenary dropped like a stone. His companion threw his weapon down and raised his hands in surrender. It was over. Black SUVs, their lights flashing, roared up the driveway. Men in tactical gear swarmed the property, securing the area with cold efficiency. Cal remained in the shadows of the barn, his rifle still ready, Aries a low growl at his side. He didn't know who these new players were. A figure detached from the group and walked toward him. A tall man with silver hair and the unmistakable bearing of a commanding officer. He stopped 20 feet away, his hands visible. "Cal, it's Thompson, Commander Thompson, his old CO. The man who had given him the news about his team. The man who had handed him his medical discharge papers." Cal slowly lowered his rifle. "Sir." Thompson walked closer, his eyes taking in the scene. The burning truck, the bodies, the fortified house. He looked at Cal, then at the magnificent, blood-streaked dog standing beside him. "Your call to Miller lit up every watch list from here to Brussels," Thompson said, his voice grim. "These men are from a private military contractor, ex-special forces. They've been operating in the shadows for years, specializing in technology theft. Aries was their golden goose." He explained it all, right there in the cold, flashing lights. Aries was more than just a MWD. He was the result of a DARPA program to create the ultimate canine soldier, enhanced genetics for speed, strength, and intelligence. After the IED blast, a corrupt contractor on site, a man named Marcus Thorne, had faked Aries' death. He'd seen the opportunity, stolen the dog amidst the chaos, and sold him on the black market for a fortune. The men who had come here tonight worked for Thorne. They were here to retrieve their asset and silence the person who found him. "We've been hunting Thorne for years," Thompson continued, "but he was always a ghost until you found his ghost." He looked at Aries with something like awe. Shep's father never gave up hope. He's a retired 4-star. He's been pulling every string he has, keeping the search alive. The mention of Shep's father hit Cal like a physical blow. He had avoided the shepherd since the funeral. The shame and guilt were too much to bear. "He asked me to give you this," Thompson said, holding out a sealed envelope. Cal took it, his hand unsteady. He stared at the familiar, elegant handwriting on the front, General Shepard. He opened it. Inside was a single handwritten page. "John, if you are reading this, it means Commander Thompson has found you, and you have found my son's dog. I know you carry a heavy burden. I want you to know that we never for a moment blamed you. David loved you like a brother. He trusted you with his life, and he would not want you to spend yours living in the shadow of his death." Before his last deployment, David updated his will. It was a simple document. He left everything he owned to you, his small savings, his old truck. He knew you'd be too proud to take it. "But there was one provision I am legally obligated to enforce." He named you the executor of his will, but more than that, he left you his most prized possession. His words were, "If anything happens to me, make sure Aries goes to Cal. He's the only one I'd trust to take care of my boy. The dog is yours, son. He always was. Bring him home, and then come home yourself. Our door is always open. George Shepard." The paper trembled in Cal's hand. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek, then another. The dam he had built inside himself. The wall of numbness and scar tissue that had held back 5 years of unspeakable grief finally broke. A ragged sob tore from his throat. He fell to his knees, his shoulders shaking. Aries pushed against him, whining softly, licking the tears from his face. The dog, his friend's last gift, his last command. "Take care of my boy." He wrapped his arms around the dog, his last link to the brother he had lost, and finally let himself grieve. He grieved for Shep, for his team, for the man he had been, and for the years he had lost to the ghosts. Thompson and his men stood back, a silent, respectful honor guard in the darkness. 1 year later, the rust was in retreat. A new roof, a gleaming dark green, sat atop the barn. The fences were taut, the posts straight and true. The fields were plowed, rich black soil, waiting for spring planting. The farmhouse windows were no longer boarded, but filled with clean glass that reflected the bright, hopeful light of an autumn afternoon. The paint was fresh, a crisp white. The farm was no longer a graveyard, it was coming back to life. So was its owner. Cal sat on the porch swing, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. The lines of pain around his eyes had softened. The haunted, hollow look was gone, replaced by a quiet calm. The scars were still there, inside and out, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They were a part of him, a map of where he had been. At his feet, Ares lay with his head on his paws, his sable coat thick and glossy. He was the picture of health and contentment, a king surveying his domain. Curled up against his side, the puppy Shep, now a lanky, half-grown version of his father, twitched in his sleep, dreaming of chasing rabbits. The front gate opened and a dusty pickup truck rolled up the drive. A woman with kind eyes and a practical smile got out. Dr. Eris Thorne, the local vet who had helped Cal nurse Ares back to health in the days after the firefight. She had seen the bond between the man and the dog and had become a frequent visitor, bringing supplies, advice, and a quiet companionship that Cal found he didn't mind. "How are my boys today?" she asked, scratching Ares behind his good ear. "Holding down the fort," Cal replied, a small smile touching his lips. They were building something here, the three of them, a sanctuary. With General Shepard's backing and Cal's experience, they were turning the farm into a haven for retired military working dogs, a place where old soldiers could live out their days in peace and dignity, a place of purpose. Cal looked out over his land, at the life returning to it. He had visited the Shepards. He had stood in their living room, impossibly, and told them about their son's last hours. They had embraced him, and in their forgiveness, he had begun to find his own. He had a new team now. A veterinarian, a pack of four-legged veterans, and a one-star general who called him son. He had a new mission. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, Ares lifted his head and rested his chin on Cal's knee. Cal looked down into those deep, intelligent eyes. He saw loyalty, honor, a shared history of fire and loss. But now he also saw peace. He saw home. Two broken warriors, two survivors of the same war, had found their way out of the darkness. Together, they had saved each other. And in the quiet dignity of the fading light, that was more than enough.